Mm. I'm doing 2 readings in an evening because Daddy's on fire. That's all you can say about that. That's all there really is to it. Daddy's on fire. The Origin of Capitalism by Ellen Meiksins Wood. Modernity, Chapter 9, Modernity and Postmodernity. The naturalization of capitalism, implicit in the conventional identification of bourgeois with capitalist, and both bourgeois and capitalist with modernity, which still persist even in today's most iconoclastic theories, has the effect of disguising the specificity of capitalism, if not conceptualizing it away altogether. Now, let us turn briefly to the other side of the coin. The point is not just that capitalism is historically specific. If some essential aspects of modernity have little to do with capitalism, then the identification of capitalism with modernity may disguise the specificity of a non-capitalist modernity too. Modernity versus capitalism, France and England. Whatever else people mean by modernity, and whether they think it is good or bad or both, they usually believe it has something to do with what sociologist Max Weber called the process of rationalization. The rationalization of the state and bureaucratic organization, the rationalization of the economy in industrial capitalism, the rationalization of culture in the spread of education, the decline of superstition, the progress of science and technology. The process of rationalization is typically associated with certain intellectual or cultural patterns that go back to the Enlightenment. Rationalism and an obsession with rational planning, a fondness for, quote, totalizing views of the world, the standardization of knowledge, universalism, a belief in universal truths and values, and a belief in linear progress, especially of reason and freedom. The Enlightenment is typically conceived of as a, if not the, major turning point in the advance of modernity, and the conflation of modernity with capitalism is most readily visible in the way theories of modernity connect the Enlightenment with capitalism. The characteristic features of the Enlightenment are supposed to be associated with the development of capitalism, either because early capitalism, in the process of unfolding itself, created them, or because the advancement of rationalization that produced the Enlightenment also brought capitalism with it. Weber, for instance, is famous for distinguishing among various meanings of rationality, formal or instrumental versus substantive, and so on. Yet his argument about the historical process of rationalization depends, of course, on assimilating the various meanings of reason and rationality, so that the instrumental rationality of capitalism is by definition related to reason in its Enlightenment meaning. For better or for worse, the process that brought us the best of Enlightenment principles, a resistance to all arbitrary power, a commitment to universal human emancipation, and a critical stance towards all kinds of authority, whether intellectual, religious, or political, is, according to this view, the same process that brought us the capitalist organization of production. To unravel the conflation of capitalism and modernity, we might begin by situating the Enlightenment in its own historical setting. Much of the Enlightenment project belongs to a distinctly non-capitalist, not just pre-capitalist society. Many features of the Enlightenment, in other words, are rooted in non-capitalist social property relations. They belong to a social form that is not just a transitional point on the way to capitalism, but an alternative route out of feudalism. In particular, the French Enlightenment belongs to the Absolutist State in France. I think that coffee's a little too hot. I just burnt my tongue. The Absolutist State in 18th century France functioned not just as a political form, but as an economic resource for a substantial section of the ruling class. In that sense, it represents not just the political, but also the economic or material context of the Enlightenment. The Absolutist State was a central instrument of extra economic surplus extraction, and office in the state was a form of property that gave its possessor access to peasant-produced surpluses. There were also other decentralized forms of extra economic appropriation. The residues of feudalism and its so-called parcelized sovereignties. These forms of extra economic appropriation were, in other words, directly antithetical to the purely economic form of capitalist exploitation. Now consider the fact that the principal home of the so-called Project of Modernity, 18th century France, was an overwhelmingly rural society with a limited and fragmented internal market. 18th century France's markets still operated on non-capitalist principles, not the appropriation of surplus value from commodified labor power, not the creation of value in production, but the age-old practice of commercial profit-taking, profit on alienation, buying cheap and selling dear, with great commercial wealth derived especially from trading in luxury goods or supplies for the state. The overwhelming peasant population was the antithesis of a mass consumer market. As for the bourgeoisie, which is supposed to be the main material source, so to speak, of the Enlightenment, it was not a capitalist class. In fact, it was not, for the most part, even a traditional commercial class. The main bourgeois actors in the Enlightenment and later in the French Revolution were professionals, office holders, and intellectuals. Their quarrel with the aristocracy had little to do with liberating capitalism from the fetters of feudalism. Where, then, did the principles of so-called modernity come from? Did they come out of a new but growing capitalism? Did they represent an aspiring capitalist class struggling against a feudal aristocracy? Can we at least say that capitalism was the unintended consequence of the project of bourgeois modernity? Or did the project represent something different? Consider the class interest of the French bourgeoisie. One way of focusing on them is to turn to the French Revolution, often treated as the culmination of the Enlightenment project. What were the main revolutionary objectives of the bourgeoisie? At the core of its program were civil equality, the attack on privilege, and the demand for, quote, careers open to talent, end quote. This meant, for example, equal access to the highest state offices, which tended to be monopolized by birth and wealth, and which the aristocracy were threatening to close off altogether. It also meant a more equitable system of taxation, so that the burden would no longer be disproportionately carried by the third estate for the benefit of the privileged estates, among whose most cherished privileges were exemptions from taxation. The target of these complaints were the aristocracy and the church. How did these bourgeois interests express themselves ideologically? Take the example of Universalism, the belief in certain principles that apply to humanity in general at all times and places. Universalism has had a long history in the West, but it had a very special meaning and salience for the French bourgeoisie. To put it briefly, the bourgeois challenge to privilege and the privileged estates to the nobility and the church expressed itself in asserting universalism against aristocratic particularism. The bourgeoisie challenged the aristocracy by invoking the universal principles of citizenship, civic equality, and the nation, a universalistic identity that transcended the more particular and exclusive identities of kinship, tribe, village, status, estate, or class. In other words, universality was opposed to privilege in its literal meaning as a special or private law. Universality stood against privilege and differential rights. It was a fairly easy step from attacking traditional privilege to attacking the principles of custom and tradition in general. And this kind of challenge easily became a theory of history, in which the bourgeoisie and its organic intellectuals were assigned a leading role in the historic agents of a rupture with the past, the embodiments of reason and freedom, the vanguard of progress. As for the bourgeois attitude towards the absolutist state, it is rather more ambiguous. As long as the bourgeoisie had reasonable access to lucrative state careers, the monarchical state suited it well, and even later the so-called bourgeois revolution completed the centralizing project of absolutism. In fact, in some ways, the bourgeois challenge to the traditional order, far from repudiating absolutist principles, simply extended them. Take again the principle of universality. The monarchical state, even in the 16th century, had challenged the feudal claims of the nobility, often with the support of the Third Estate and the bourgeoisie in particular, by claiming to represent universality against the particularity of the nobility and other competing jurisdictions. The bourgeoisie also inherited and extended other absolutist principles. The preoccupation with rational planning and standardization, for example, pioneered by the Absolutist State and its leading officials like Richelieu and Colbert. After all, even the standardization of the French language was part of the Absolutist State's centralizing project, a project of rationalization that had its classical cultural expression in the formal gardens at Versailles. Scholars like Marshall Berman and David Harvey, who have given us some of the most important treatments of modernity and postmodernity, often emphasize the duality of the modern consciousness, which goes back to the Enlightenment. That dualistic sensibility, they say, combines universality and immutability with a sensitivity to ephemerality, contingency, fragmentation. The argument seems to be that the preoccupation with universality and absolute truth was from the start an attempt to make sense out of the fleeting, ephemeral and constantly mobile and changing experience of modern life, which they associate with capitalism. Marshall Berman, quotes some passages from Rousseau's novel Julie ou la Nouvelle Héloïse, written in 1761, as one of the earliest expressions of that sensibility. Berman calls Rousseau, quote, the archetypal modern voice in the early phase of modernity, end quote. The most telling passage comes from a letter in which Rousseau's character, Saint Preux, records his reactions on coming to Paris. What Berman sees here is the modernist sense of new possibilities, combined with the unease and uncertainty that comes from constant motion, change, and diversity. It is an experience that Berman associates with an early phase of capitalism. But we can perhaps see something rather different in the words of Saint Preux, or even in Berman's own account of the maelstrom of modern life. We can see not so much the experience of modern capitalism as the age-old fear and fascination aroused by the city. So much of what Rousseau's Saint Preux and Marshall Berman himself have to say about the experience of, quote, modern life could have been said by the Italian country dweller arriving in the ancient city of Rome. It may be no accident that literary tropes associated with this, quote, experience of modernity, Rousseau's and those of other European writers, typically come not from a highly urbanized society, but from societies with a still overwhelmingly rural population. Mouth's getting dry. At any rate, the ideology of the French bourgeoisie in the 18th century had not much to do with capitalism and much more to do with struggles over non-capitalist forms of appropriation, conflicts over extra economic powers of exploitation. There is no need to reduce the Enlightenment to crude class ideology. After all, among some of the greatest Enlightenment figures were aristocrats like Condorcet. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm bad at French names. I always say them wrong, and it seems like a lot of people know French-ish. Maybe not French, but they know how the pronunciations work, and you look kind of like an ass. You don't pronounce them right. So I'm very embarrassed if I got that wrong. Condorcet. The point is rather that in this particular historical conjuncture, in distinctly non-capitalist conditions, even bourgeois class ideology took the form of a larger vision of general human emancipation, not just emancipation for the bourgeoisie. For all its limitations, this was an emancipatory universalism, which is, of course, why it could be taken up by much more democratic and revolutionary forces. To see the complexities here, we need only compare France with England. To reiterate, England in the 18th century, at the height of agrarian capitalism, had a growing urban population, which formed a much larger proportion of the total population than in France. Small proprietors were being dispossessed, not just by direct coercion, but also by economic pressures. London was the largest city in Europe. There was a far more integrated and competitive internal market, the first national market in the world. There already existed the beginning of a mass consumer market for cheap everyday goods, especially food and textiles, and an increasingly proletarianized workforce. England's productive base in agriculture was already operating on essentially capitalist principles, with an aristocracy deeply involved in agrarian capitalism and the new forms of commerce. And England was in the process of creating an industrial capitalism. What were the characteristic cultural and ideological expressions of English capitalism in the same period? Not Cartesian rationalism and rational planning, but the, quote, invisible hand of classical political economy and the philosophy of British empiricism. Not the formal Garden of Versailles, but the irregular, apparently unplanned natural landscape garden. Even the English state that promoted the early rise of capitalism was far less rational in Weberian terms than was the bureaucratic state of the French Ancien regime. And the English legal system, based on the common law, is today less rational than the Napoleonic code that followed the French Revolution, or other continental systems based on Roman law. This is not, of course, to say that the English played no part in the more general European Enlightenment. It hardly needs saying, for instance, that English thinkers made important contributions to the critical temper of the Enlightenment. And there certainly was, in England, an interest in science and technology shared with its European neighbors. Nor should it need saying that the French Enlightenment itself owed much to Bacon. Nor should it need saying that the French Enlightenment itself owed much to Bacon, Locke, and Newton. But the characteristic ideology that set England apart from other European cultures was above all the ideology of improvement. Not the Enlightenment idea of the improvement of humanity, but the improvement of property, the ethic, and indeed the science of profit, the commitment to increasing the productivity of labor, the production of exchange value, and the practice of enclosure and dispossession. I'm going to reread that sentence, not because I misunderstood it, but because I feel like it kind of like hammers home the entire point of this chapter. But the characteristic ideology that set England apart from other European cultures was above all the ideology of improvement, not the Enlightenment idea of the improvement of humanity, but the improvement of property, the ethic and indeed the science of profit, the commitment to increasing the productivity of labor, the production of exchange value, and the practice of enclosure and dispossession. This ideology, especially the notion of agricultural improvement and the associated improvement literature produced in England, was conspicuously absent in 18th century France, where peasants dominated production and landlords retained their rentier mentality, as for that matter did the bourgeoisie on the whole. The exception, by the way, proves the rule. The physiocrats those French political economists for whom English agriculture was a model to emulate. If we want to look for the roots of a destructive modernity, the ideology of, say, technocentrism and ecological degradation, we might start by looking in the project of improvement. The subordination of all human values to productivity and profit, rather than in the Enlightenment. Might we say that it is no accident that the mad cow disease scandal happened in Britain, the birthplace of improvement, or that more recently, Britain has seen the most massive outbreak of foot and mouth disease, widely attributed to intensive farming and marketing practices. There's a question mark on the end of that sentence, so I felt like I should have said it differently. Let's try it again. Hold on. Might we say that it is no accident that the mad cow disease scandal happened in Britain, the birthplace of improvement, or that more recently, Britain has seen the most massive outbreak of foot and mouth disease, widely attributed to intensive farming and marketing practice? I feel like I just sounded like, if you remember in Young Frankenstein, when like the young student is like pressing what's his name? Is that Gene Wilder? Gene Wilder, Victor Frankenstein, about his grandfather's works, like, and didn't your father do this to dead bodies? And didn't your father do this and that? And I don't know. No one needs to hear all that. Postmodernity. Attacking the so-called Enlightenment project has by now become an unthinking cliche. The Enlightenment values enumerated earlier are supposed to be, and this is one of the milder indictments, quote, at the root of the disasters that have racked humanity throughout the 20th century, end quote. Everything from world wars and imperialism to ecological destruction. This is not the place to pursue all the latest absurdities, by now far exceeding the reasonable insights that may once have been contained in the critiques of the Enlightenment. With their acknowledgement of its duality, both the good and the evils that have issued from its principles of reason and progress. The important point is that we are being invited to jettison all that is best in the Enlightenment project, especially its commitment to universal human emancipation, and to blame these values for destructive effects we should be ascribing to capitalism. Amen, sister. I'm going to repeat that one, because I like that sentence. The important point is that we are being invited to jettison all that is best in the Enlightenment project, especially its commitment to a universal human emancipation, and to blame these values for the destructive effects we should be ascribing to capitalism. You got that, kids? There are then many reasons, intellectual and political, for separating out the Enlightenment project from those aspects of our current condition that overwhelmingly belong not to the, quote, project of modernity, but to capitalism. As commonly used, the concept of modernity dissolves some essential distinctions between social and cultural forms that do belong to capitalism and those that do not belong to capitalism. In its tendency to conflate bourgeois with capitalist, it belongs to the standard view of history that takes capitalism for granted as the outcome of already existing tendencies, even natural laws, when and where they are given a chance. In the evolutionary process leading from early forms of exchange to modern industrial capitalism, I'm getting lost here. In its tendency to conflate bourgeois with capitalist, it belongs to the standard view of history that takes capitalism for granted as the outcome of already existing tendencies, even natural laws, when and where they are given a chance. In the evolutionary process leading from early forms of exchange to modern industrial capitalism, modernity kicks in when these shackled economic forces and bourgeois economic rationality are liberated from traditional constraints. And so, modernity equals bourgeois society equals capitalism. This isn't Wood's view. This is other people's view. The concept of modernity has recently been supplemented with the idea of postmodernity. The postmodern epoch has been variously described, but always, of course, in relation to modernity. Postmodernity generally represents a phase of capitalism marked by certain distinctive economic and technological characteristics. The, quote, information age, or, quote, lean production, or, quote, flexible accumulation, or, quote, disorganized capitalism, consumerism, and so on. But more particularly, it is marked by certain cultural formations summed up in the formula postmodernism, whose single most outstanding feature is its challenge to the Enlightenment project. Postmodernism is said to have replaced the culture of modernism and the intellectual patterns associated with the project of modernity. The project of modernity, according to these accounts, seems to have begun in the 18th century, or at least its defining moment was the Enlightenment, though it came to fruition in the 19th century. The so-called Enlightenment project is again supposed to represent rationalism, technocentrism, the standardization of knowledge and production, a belief in linear progress, and in universal absolute truths. Postmodernism is understood as a reaction to that project, though postmodernism can also be seen as rooted in modernism, in the skepticism and the emphasis on uncertainty, change and contingency associated with modernist cultural forms in the 18th century, which were, some would argue, already present in the Enlightenment. Postmodernism sees the world as essentially fragmented and indeterminate, rejects any, quote, totalizing discourses, any, quote, meta-narratives, any comprehensive and universalistic theories about the world and history. It also rejects any universalistic political projects, even universalistic emancipatory projects. In other words, projects for a general human emancipation rather than very particular struggles against very diverse and particular oppressions. I'm getting fired up thinking about this line of thought and how common it is. It's fucking lame. Some theories of postmodernity have been very illuminating, telling us much about contemporary capitalism and especially about its cultural forms. But the concept itself is, in essence, an inversion of modernity in its conventional meaning and carries with it many of the same problematic presuppositions. This modernity belongs to a view of history that cuts across the great divide between capitalist and non-capitalist societies, a view that treats specifically capitalist laws of motion as if they were the universal laws of history, and lumps together various very different historical developments, capitalist and non-capitalist. The idea of postmodernity is derived from a conception of modernity at its worst, makes capitalism historically invisible, or at the very least, naturalizes it. It is important to notice, too, that even the critique of modernity can have the same effect of naturalizing capitalism. This effect was already visible long before today's postmodernist fashions. For instance, in the sociological theories of Max Weber, specifically his theory of rationalization. The process of rationalization, the progress of reason and freedom associated with the Enlightenment, had, according to Weber, liberated humanity from traditional constraints, but at the same time rationalization had produced and disguised a new oppression, the iron cage of modern organizational forms. There is, of course, much to be said for acknowledging the two sides of modernity, not only the advances it is said to represent, but also the destructive possibilities inherent in its productive capacities, its technologies, and its organizational forms, even in its universalistic values. But in an argument like Weber's, there is something more. Capitalism, like bureaucratic domination, is just a natural extension of the long-term progress of reason and freedom. It is worth noting, too, that in Weber we find something loosely akin to the postmodernist ambivalence towards capitalism, in which lament is never very far away from celebration. So postmodernity follows a modernity in which bourgeois is identical with capitalist, and Enlightenment rationalism is indistinguishable from the economic rationality of capitalism. These equations unavoidably entail some familiar assumptions about the origin of capitalism, especially that capitalism is already present in bourgeois rationality, just waiting for the moment of release. The idea of postmodernity certainly focuses our attention on historical transformations within capitalism, but it does so by disguising the transformations between capitalist and non-capitalist societies. The specificity of capitalism is again lost in the continuities of history, and the capitalist system is naturalized in the inevitable progress of the eternally rising bourgeoisie.